All right, my name is Matt Gagnon, and I'm the CEO of the Maine Heritage Policy Center, and I want to welcome everyone here and thank them for coming to our press conference here today for the release of the Let Us Work, Resurrecting Entrepreneurship by Removing Barriers to Economic Opportunity report. That's a mouthful, but basically it's a look into occupational licensing and an evaluation of exactly what that looks like in the state of Maine and exactly how it's actually holding back people from pursuing their dreams and pursuing economic opportunity. I'll get to some of the details of that report in just a moment. We have behind me Jake Posik, the author of this report, here to tell you just a little bit more about that, and he's happy to answer some questions once he's done with his comments about sort of the contents of it. But I do want to take just a moment to highlight what a sensitive topic this is, because when you're talking about occupational licensing, it doesn't sound like the sexiest topic. It doesn't sound like the thing that might affect the Maine economy the most, but it really does have a gigantic effect on how we earn a living in the state of Maine. People are right now in the state thinking about and trying to earn a living in a variety of different economic sectors and are prevented from doing so by some form of barrier that's placed in front of them, whether it's a licensing fee, educational requirements, training requirements, things that are required of them that are not necessary for the pursuit of their field. And this is true in industry after industry after industry. And it's really held up by a group of people that are trying to protect their own jobs and stop competition from affecting them. The people that benefit the most from licensing regimes across the state are the people that currently hold licenses. And so it's in their best economic interest to try to hold out as many competitors as possible and stop them from joining the fun and trying to compete with them and undercut their prices in business. That's wrong. If you have a skill in this state and you'd like to pursue it, you should be able to do so without interference from the state, unless it has some form of health or safety issue that is circulating around that job. So to highlight, though, just how tough this issue can be and just how much it can affect people and make them fearful of their livelihoods, we actually probably should quickly break down what this press conference was originally supposed to look like. Because behind me originally was actually going to be some folks that have experienced this problem. They've been trying to get into a certain industry, they have the skills to do so, they would do a good job, and they would compete very well in that industry, but were held out in some fashion. And today they are not here because they are afraid of telling their story, because the licensing regime that currently exists, it would prevent them from actually entering this industry. So they're not here with us today. But since they weren't able to join us, and being sensitive to who they are and exactly what they have to face in their jobs and their industries, I did want to quickly highlight just the story of who they are, if not their names and their specific businesses and what they do. Just the story of them, I think, probably should communicate just how important this is. The first one that was going to join us was actually an insurance agent. It's a small business owner running a small insurance agency that also offers bank products and mutual fund investments. He's been practicing for 39 years and is lucky to have 3 additional full-time staff, fully licensed to do business in all 3 financial disciplines. Every year, he and his staff are asked to do compliance in all 3 areas, which cost him thousands of dollars in time and also fees. He renews all licensing requirements faithfully each year, in addition to all the continuing education requirements to renew each license. So much of the 3 financial disciplines, ethics, and so on and so forth, are redundant and overreaching from each of the financial requirements and courses for each government entity. There is no logical reason to maintain these 3 separate and overlapping systems, yet of course they persist because that is what the system does. We also were going to hear from a real estate agent who first received their state license in 1973. The business was simple and the banks did everything in-house. Back then the license was $0 for 2 years. Got the broker's license in 1975 and enjoyed the business greatly. In 1978, however, their own real estate company was founded and they expanded to 4 offices and 34 agents eventually, so it grew rather significantly. Licensing fees and continuing education, however, continued to grow. The state raised license fees and made continuing education a molehill into a mountain. What the state failed to recognize was that the lack of integrity and morals had reached an all-time low. Could not continue to develop young couples buying homes that I knew they could not afford. The banking industry became rife with mortgage brokers who earned their income by getting approvals at all costs. In 2003, had to close the office and walk away from the business entirely. This is another experience where their licensing regime is disincentivizing the right people from being there and holding people out who could do a good job. There's also a forester that was going to speak to us that was employed in one of Maine's paper companies and is working towards being licensed as a forester. Normally, a person will get a 4-year forest management degree and then work 2 years as an intern under a licensed forester, which is a reasonable requirement according to this individual. He was also a logging contractor, however, for 5 years, and then attended college where he received a Bachelor's of Science in Conservation Law Enforcement. He worked for 10 years getting back into the forest products industry, and then became licensed as a wood scaler, and during that time received an MBA. So clearly a highly qualified individual. He checked with the state to see what would be required for him to become licensed as a forester, which seems to be something from the story that would be skills he already has and not necessary to actually be redundant. He was told that he has to take the path of an unlicensed individual. No experience as a contractor would qualify because it was more than 10 years prior, and no college education would count because of the degree name, even though the subject matter was actually very applicable. So again, we're talking about sort of arbitrary rules and requirements that really have no place in this particular industry. So those are just 3 quick stories, and there's a lot more details to go with each one, but you know, the thing that really stands out to me is that they're not here. They're too afraid of actually telling their story publicly to participate in something like this because they're afraid that they're going to get a license denied or that the regime is going to come down on them. That's wrong, and that highlights exactly what's wrong with this system. So again, we are releasing a report about this today. We're going to be breaking down all of the different occupations that actually have licenses, what those licenses mean, and exactly what's wrong with the system. And here to tell you a little bit more about the actual contents and details of that report is Jake Posik. He is the policy analyst at the Maine Heritage Policy Center and is the author of this report, and he has a lot more of those details right now. Jake?
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. As Matt said, my name is Jake Posik. I'm the policy analyst at MHPC, and I am the primary author of this report. In this report, we found that Maine actively licenses at least 162 different occupations, a figure that swells to more than 200 when you include aide, apprenticeship, associate, instructor, and training, limited, temporary, or trainee licenses associated with the profession. Overall, 1 in 4 Maine professionals are required to be licensed, a trend that holds at the national level as well. The stated purpose of occupational licensing is to protect consumers from unqualified practitioners whose goods and services could cause undue physical harm or financial burden, yet Maine licenses a number of occupations where the risks to the public are unclear. These professions include barbers, boxers, land surveyors, mixed martial arts competitors, and sardine packers, among many others. Maine also licenses a number of occupations that are licensed in 7 or fewer states, calling into question the necessity of these licenses. These occupations include animal control officers, dietetic technicians, electrical helpers, funeral attendants, log scalers, and packagers. Additionally, we found a wealth of data related to the arbitrary nature of occupational licensing laws, which Matt just touched upon a moment ago. Among professions where the need for licensing is ambiguous, it appears state regulators have aimlessly applied licensing restrictions. Some states license the same occupation but impose varying levels of education or experience requirements or levy disproportionate fees. If you want to legally practice as a barber in New Hampshire, you must pass 2 exams, pay $129 in annual fees, and acquire 187 days worth of relevant work experience. In Maine, the experience threshold for an aspiring barber is 350 days, along with 3 exams and $41 in fees. It is not more dangerous to practice as a barber in Maine as opposed to New Hampshire, nor is the potential risk to the public any more substantial, yet both states impose vastly different licensing requirements on their professionals. The average low to moderate income professional practicing in a licensed occupation in Maine must pay $181 in fees, devote 298 days to training, and pass 1 exam just in order to obtain a license to work in the state of Maine. In many ways, Maine licensing regimes do not pass the straight face test. Log scalers, who measure and estimate the value of logs, are required to obtain 730 days or 2 years of relevant work experience before they can legally practice in Maine. It's also worth noting that only Maine and Idaho license this profession. However, emergency medical technicians, whose work undoubtedly impacts the health and safety of Maine citizens, are only required to obtain 26 days of work experience before practicing in Maine. Our study also highlights a 2013 report by Maine's Office of Policy and Management that recommended the repeal of the licensing regimes associated with athletic trainers, dietitians, dietetic technicians, geologists, interior designers, landscape architects and soil scientists for having insignificant health and safety benefits, inactive boards, or limited histories of public complaint. Despite these findings in 2013, all 7 professions remain licensed in Maine. Finally, the overwhelming consensus of scholarly research related to occupational licensing reveals that licensing does more harm than good unless enacted with extreme parsimony and care. Licensing has been found to reduce competition, inflate the overall cost of goods and services, hinder entrepreneurship, and primarily impacts low-income individuals whose low-cost alternatives are eliminated through licensing. A 2013 study found that occupational licensing in Maine results in deadweight economic losses of more than $276 million, meaning the cost of licensing in Maine amounts to more than $4,700 per household. In addition, we often talk about what we can do to attract talented people to our state, and licensing is a significant barrier in this regard, as most licenses in Maine are not reciprocal across state lines. There is no reason why somebody who has been practicing for decades as a licensed professional in another state cannot simply pack up, move to Maine, and continue practicing. I will conclude my remarks today by saying that nobody in this room is suggesting that we should eliminate every occupational license law on the books in Maine. However, licensing should be limited in scope as a number of regulatory alternatives exist. These alternatives, such as Deceptive Trade Practice Acts, inspections, bonding, or insurance, are rarely considered by lawmakers before new licensing regimes are implemented. Among some licensed occupations in Maine, market competition alone could eliminate or reduce the health and safety risks associated with the profession, if any exist. In professions where the need for licensing is inherent, licenses should stay. However, the scope of occupational licensing in Maine extends far beyond what is truly necessary and is in desperate need of review, because as consumers of goods and services in the state of Maine, we must all pay the price of occupational licensing. And with that said, I will turn the podium over to Representative Joel Stetkis of Gagnon.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity today to share a little bit of my perspective on what I feel is much needed occupational license reform. I come at this first and foremost as someone with hands-on experience, started a business and created Maine jobs in residential construction for about 30 years, and over that time I've held a few different occupational licenses. More recently, part of my experience comes as a legislator serving on the Labor, Commerce, Research, and Economic Development Committee, which oversees occupational licensing here in Maine. As a legislator, I've had an opportunity during many public hearings to see a wide variety of positive and negative issues when it comes to professional licensing in Maine. From these experiences, I have seen that professional occupational licensing in Maine has grown well beyond its original intent to protect the health and safety of the public. These much-needed common sense reforms will no doubt be a heavy lift under the current professional licensing culture, and I'm here today to lend my support and help in any way I can to achieve these much-needed goals. Within the current culture, I've witnessed firsthand that a lot of the general public believe that having to be a licensed professional somehow guarantees quality or competence. In my experience, it does not. Having worked on thousands of job sites with contractors from every aspect of residential construction, it won't be surprising to anyone when I say that not all plumbers, electricians, well drillers, or even realtors are created equally. Requiring licenses is not and will not change that. We need to look into each and every profession currently requiring licensing and determine if they truly pose a health and safety risk or not. If not, what might be better options than a license and all that accompanies one? Today I want to be clear, my support for common sense reform is not the elimination of all occupational licenses. Reform is returning to the original intent of occupational licensing, as well as making it less expensive and less arduous for people with the skills and education to get to work in their industry. I think my barber might be a good example. Alan has been in the business for about 40 years. How does it make any sense that if he doesn't fill out the paperwork and pay his licensing fee, somehow he becomes a risk to the health and safety of the general public on the expiration date of last year's license. Not only that, he can no longer earn a living doing exactly what he has done for the last 40 years. In this particular case, has licensing gone beyond ensuring the safety of the public? Might it make more sense for a one-time certification that states that he has the required education or experience? Now, from the occupational and professional side, some have come to believe that having their occupation licensed by the state somehow gives them a sort of stamp of approval or a sense of legitimacy. For some, anything less than a state-approved license somehow makes them less valued. Changing the paradigm for some professionals in the general public that their value comes from hard work and putting into service the skills and the education that they have attained. The idea that their value does not suddenly materialize from a permission slip in the form of a license from a government agency will certainly be a challenge. Several months ago, I got a frantic phone call from a constituent frustrated with navigating the bureaucracy of physically having a copy of the license he achieved a couple months earlier. This young man completed his schooling while working to provide for his family, fulfilled the required hours of service, and passed the license exam. But until he had a copy in hand, his employer wasn't able to put him to work using those skills, which meant a substantial pay raise for the young man and better customer service for his employer's clients. I was told that ultimately this delay meant thousands of dollars in missed wages for my constituent. I believe reducing hard-to-understand red tape and streamlining operations needs to also be a piece of reform. For me, another very important piece of reform is the cost to the licensee. In some cases, the cost to hold or maintain a license is more than just the annual fee. In one particular case, some seasoned professionals testified at a public hearing. They had worked in their industry for 30 or 40 years. They had honed their skill set to specific areas of their career field, and that's all that they dealt with. With gradual changes to their licensing requirements, there is now mandatory continuing education. These folks testified that to maintain the license that they have held for decades, they are now required to learn new things that they will never use. They also said that in most cases they would have to travel outside of the state at a substantial cost to attend these classes or seminars, as well as miss work. All of this to be allowed to continue to make a living in their chosen career. A one-size-fits-all mandatory approach doesn't seem fair and should be reformed. Then there's the actual fee paid by licensees and how those fees are used. This is a piece of reform that affects all licensees. Are you being overcharged for permission to use your skills to earn a living? Are those fees being used for the intended purpose? These are very important questions that need to be addressed. I would submit that it is a fact that licensees are being substantially overcharged and a large portion of those funds are being abused. Every single licensee that I have talked with and told them a portion of their fees sent to the Department of Professional and Financial Regulation are not being used for their intended purposes, but has become a slush fund for politicians in Augusta to dip into and to pay for offset funding for their pet projects. In the last 2 years alone, the Department of Professional and Financial Regulation account has nearly had $20 million, hard for me to say, $20 million has been raided by politicians in Augusta. You can just imagine the outrage from hardworking Mainers when they find out about this abuse. These are just a few of the things that have compelled me to be here today, and I want to thank you for listening, and I look forward to working with everyone and anyone to bring common sense reforms to Maine's occupational licensing. And with that, I have the privilege to introduce my friend Senator Brakey, who has spent a good amount of time in Augusta working on some of these reforms. And I look forward for more good ideas to come.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative. Well, thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you for those who will be watching on video as well. My name is Brakey. I'm a two-term state senator, and I'm proud to represent the people of the communities of Auburn, New Gloucester, Poland, Minot, and Mechanic Falls. And we're here today talking about this report. Let us work. That's what it's about. Let us work. And the government not letting people work, or at least not without jumping through many arbitrary and tedious and problematic challenges in order to be able to offer their labor to others. Now, in the legislature over the last several years, there has been some progress made on occupational licensing. And I will say this is an issue that I'm very passionate about, because it affects some of the most vulnerable people economically in our state who are simply trying to get ahead but have government barriers artificially put in front of them, preventing their ability to be economically mobile and to climb the ladder and to do better for themselves. Now, of course, occupational licensing is put in place for the stated purpose of protecting public safety. And with the goal of protecting public safety, it would be no surprise certain professions that are licensed. We license doctors, we license medical professionals. That makes a certain kind of sense if we're talking about public safety. If you have someone who doesn't know what they're doing in medicine, they can do tremendous harm to someone. But many Maine people would be very surprised to find out that we license things like interior designers. I mean, heaven forbid you have an unlicensed interior designer and you end up with the bad shag carpeting in your home that clashes with everything on your walls. I mean, the horror to Maine people if that would happen. There's no legitimate way that it can be claimed that some of these occupational licensing requirements that are in place protect the public safety. Now, we have made some progress, as I was saying before. Some limited progress has been made in the legislature over the last several years. And thankfully, because this has not always been a partisan issue. In fact, we've made some bipartisan progress. You know, over the last several years, there was a Democrat state senator, Senator Ann Haskell from Portland, who sponsored legislation to eliminate occupational licensing for hair braiders. So imagine this, you know, if you wanted to braid people's hair, you potentially had to get an expensive license, which could require years of schooling in cosmetology and oftentimes getting this license and going through all the educational processes, they didn't even teach you hair braiding. But you had to learn how to do everything else with people's hair in order to be able to braid people's hair. When braiding people's hair, it's completely reversible. You braid someone's hair wrong, and you know what? You can try it again. A person's health and safety is not in danger. Thankfully, the legislature saw common sense. I was proud to co-sponsor that bill along with Democrat Senator Ann Haskell, and it passed unanimously through the House, the Senate, and through the Committee of Jurisdiction. Now, just a year later, I inspired by Senator Ann Haskell's work and seeing the problems that occupational licensing creates for so many Maine people who are trying to get ahead, I sponsored my own legislation to take a more comprehensive look at many of the occupational licensing requirements that are in place across the state over a whole host of professions, and to simply study it, to look at, you know, a lot of these things have been in place for years and years, have never come up for review, and there's been no opportunity to evaluate, is this something that is protecting the public interest, or is this something that is simply protecting people with licenses from competition, and is that working against the public interest? Even sponsoring that legislation to simply study the issue, we saw a whole host of individuals come out, folks established with licenses, coming out to rail against this legislation and defeat it, which sadly they did. We couldn't even study the issue because there are so many entrenched interests in place. People who are protected from competition and protected from those without the means to be able to satisfy these arbitrary licensing requirements. They're people protected from that competition. So I'm very glad to see this report, Let Us Work. We should all be able to agree that if someone wants to work, if someone wants to sell their labor to their fellow Maine citizens, their fellow Maine people, And in doing so, they present no risk to public health or safety. They should not be threatened with fines from the government, and they should not be threatened with prison time from the government if they do not comply and they do not get this artificial permission slip from the government to be able to work. That simply is repugnant to the entire idea of a free society. It's repugnant to the idea of free markets and the idea that we own our labor and can sell it to people, to any person who's willing to buy it from us. It's time for reform. It's time to let people work. And I am very hopeful we will continue making progress over the coming years, and I'm hopeful that this report will be the foundation and the basis for that. So thank you very much for having me here today, and I'm going to welcome back to the podium Matt Gagnon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
I'll just have a quick parting thought before we go ahead and open it up for questions if we have any. You know, we have a position at the Maine Heritage Policy Center, which I think you heard well articulated a moment ago by Senator Brakey, that you have a right to earn a living. If you have skills and you can market those skills and people are happy to pay you for them, there is nothing that should stand in the way of that, so long as you just heard a moment ago, it does not threaten the health or safety of your fellow Mainers. That is our bar, and that's what this report is about. We're identifying exactly what the landscape looks like here, where the challenges are, and where we can make a big difference in helping some Mainers work if they want to. So the core of the report is about that, and if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer some now. All right, seeing none, we have some availability. Terry Brown, our communications director, is available. If you have any questions afterwards, you think of any, email them or call us at the office. We're happy to answer those questions. I want to say a quick thank you to everybody who is here with us on the podium telling a little bit of their story, because this is a very vitally important issue that affects a lot more Mainers than you think it does. And it has a massive economic impact. And we don't notice it, and we should, and that's what this report is about. So again, thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to answering your questions in the future. Thanks.